Louisville, Kentucky, 2016. John Carter's house stood in a quiet suburban neighborhood where life flowed at a slow, predictable pace. The streets were lined with neat houses, well-kept lawns, and the occasional parked car glistening under the dim glow of streetlights. It was the kind of place where people greeted their neighbors, where porch lights flickered on at dusk, and where the biggest disturbance was a barking dog or the distant wail of a police siren from the city center. After his wife's death, John had devoted himself entirely to raising his daughter, Monica. She was 19, smart, and driven, a student at the local college with aspirations of becoming a doctor. Their house, though quieter now, was still filled with warmth. Even without Monica's mother, the two of them had forged a life that, in its own way, felt complete. John worked long hours as an auto mechanic, coming home each evening exhausted but eager to spend time with his daughter. Their nights were often spent watching movies together, laughing over the same jokes they had heard a dozen times before. That night, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The evening air was cool, and the hum of crickets filled the darkness beyond the house. The streets were nearly deserted, save for the occasional car rolling by with its headlights cutting through the quiet. The only lights in the Carter home came from a small lamp in the living room and the faint glow from Monica's bedroom, where she was still awake, studying for an upcoming exam. John had gone to bed early. His body ached from a long day at the shop, and he had dozed off almost immediately. His room was dark, the thick curtains blocking out any light from the street. The house was still, save for the faint rustling of pages from Monica's room as she flipped through her textbook. She stifled a yawn, rubbing her eyes as she stretched. Just as she reached for the switch to turn off her lamp, a sound reached her ears. Faint. Almost imperceptible. A soft, metallic scraping. Her breath caught in her throat as she listened, her fingers frozen just above the switch. For a moment, she convinced herself it was nothing, maybe the wind outside, a branch tapping against the window. But then it came again. A low, deliberate creak, like the slow turning of a doorknob. A cold wave of fear washed over her. Before she could react, a sudden, forceful crash echoed through the house. The front door had been kicked open. The impact sent a jolt through the wooden floors, the vibrations traveling up through her legs as she sat rigid on the edge of her bed. Heavy footsteps thudded against the floorboards. Slow, measured. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she glanced at her door, her mind racing. The footsteps grew louder, moving through the hallway. Then, they stopped, right outside her bedroom door. At that moment, John stirred. His years of living in rough neighborhoods as a young man had left him with an instinct for danger. The noise jolted him awake. His body tensed, the faint sound of footsteps in the house instantly setting off alarm bells in his mind. His first thought was Monica. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, reaching for the baseball bat that leaned against the corner of his room. The weight of it was familiar in his hands, a comfort he had never needed before but was suddenly grateful for. His breath was steady, but his heart was hammering in his chest as he stepped out of the bedroom. The dim hallway stretched before him, shadows flickering in the faint glow from the living room. Then he saw them. Two men. Dressed in dark clothes, their faces obscured by black masks. They stood just feet away, their bodies tense with anticipation, like predators waiting to strike. John didn't hesitate. With every ounce of strength in his body, he swung the bat at the nearest intruder. The taller man reacted instantly, jerking backward just as the bat cut through the air where his ribs had been a second earlier. The momentum threw John slightly off balance, just enough for the second man to lunge. A heavy, crushing blow struck John's temple. A sharp burst of pain erupted in his skull, and the world tilted violently. His knees buckled. As he fell, the last thing he saw was the masked figures looming over him, their dark silhouettes merging with the shadows. And then, nothing. When consciousness returned, John felt an unbearable pressure around his wrists and ankles. His limbs were immobile, bound tightly by a rough, unyielding rope. A dull, throbbing pain radiated from the back of his skull, pulsating with each beat of his heart. His mouth was dry, his throat raw, as if he had been screaming in his sleep. He blinked several times, his vision swimming in and out of focus, struggling to make sense of his surroundings. The dim glow of a broken lamp cast jagged shadows across the living room. The coffee table had been overturned, papers and books scattered across the floor. The couch cushions were slashed open, their stuffing spilling out like the entrails of a gutted animal. Shattered glass from a picture frame glittered near the television, reflecting the weak light like tiny stars. The house that had once been their sanctuary was now a crime scene. Then, a sound pierced through the silence. At first, it was muffled, as though it came from behind a thick wall. A whimper, barely audible, a choked sob struggling to escape. Then, a voice, raw, filled with terror, strangled with desperation. His name. The cry sent a spike of ice through John's veins. Monica's voice. Every muscle in his body strained against the restraints, his arms jerking, legs kicking wildly against the floor. The rope dug deep into his skin, biting into the flesh, but he didn't care. He twisted, pulled, fought against the knots with every ounce of strength he had left. Footsteps pounded above him. Heavy, deliberate. The floorboards creaked beneath shifting weight. A sudden, sharp noise, a slap, flesh striking flesh, followed by a sharp intake of breath. Then, laughter. Low and taunting. John felt his chest tighten, his lungs burning as he sucked in frantic, ragged breaths. The laughter twisted into something vile, something that made his stomach churn with nausea and rage. He could hear Monica's sobs, each one weaker than the last, and it was as if a knife had been driven into his soul, twisting deeper with every sound. He wanted to scream, but when he opened his mouth, only a hoarse rasp escaped. His voice was gone, strangled by fear and helplessness. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms so hard he felt the sting of broken skin. The minutes stretched into eternity. He didn't know how long he lay there, listening to the horror taking place just beyond his reach. He begged, prayed, to wake up, to find out this was some cruel nightmare, that he would roll over in bed and see Monica safe, smiling, untouched by the darkness that had invaded their home. But the nightmare did not end. And then, silence. A deep, oppressive stillness settled over the house. The only sound was the hammering of his own heart in his ears. The footsteps returned, slower now. He heard the distant sound of a zipper, fabric shifting. Then, the front door creaked open. A gust of cold air whispered through the house, and then, nothing. They were gone. John lay there, motionless, his mind frozen in a suffocating quiet. The adrenaline that had surged through his veins now abandoned him, leaving only exhaustion and the unbearable weight of reality. A minute passed. Then another. Soft, uneven footsteps approached. Monica appeared in his line of sight. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and distant, barely registering his presence. Her arms trembled as she reached down, fumbling with the knots that held him captive. Blood stained the edges of her ripped nightgown. Finger-shaped bruises were already beginning to form on her arms, her legs. Her lower lip was split, a trickle of red snaking down her chin. John could only watch, helpless as she worked through her shaking hands, freeing him one limb at a time. The moment his hands were loose, he pulled her into his arms, clutching her against his chest. She didn't resist. Her body was limp, cold, as if all the life had been drained from her. She did not speak. Did not cry. She was there, but at the same time, she wasn't. John held her, rocking back and forth, whispering words of comfort neither of them believed. He felt her shallow breaths against his neck, and for a moment, all he could do was press his lips to her temple and let silent tears slip down his face. That morning, the hospital admitted Monica into the psychiatric ward. John went home alone. John couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that terrible scream. It echoed through his mind like a ghost that refused to be silenced. The sound of Monica's voice, raw with fear, her cries for help, the laughter of those men, it all played on an endless loop, tormenting him whether he was awake or dreaming. His world had lost its color. The warmth of the morning sun meant nothing. The taste of food turned to ash in his mouth. He moved through each day like a man trapped in a fog, unable to feel anything except the crushing weight of guilt and helplessness. He had always believed that a father's duty was to protect his child. That belief had been shattered, leaving behind nothing but the hollow shell of the man he once was. Every morning, he went to the hospital. Monica lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, barely acknowledging his presence. The doctors spoke in careful, measured tones, explaining that she had severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was barely a whisper, like she was afraid of being heard. John sat beside her, holding her hand, though she hardly reacted to his touch. He read to her sometimes, even when he knew she wasn't listening. He told her stories about when she was little, about her mother, about the time she fell off her bike and refused to cry because she wanted to prove she was tough. Nothing reached her. It was as if something inside her had broken, and no amount of love could put it back together. At night, when he returned to their empty home, he sat in the dark, staring at the walls. Sleep never came. When exhaustion finally took him, he would jolt awake within minutes, covered in cold sweat, heart pounding in his chest. The house felt different now, stripped of the sense of safety it once held. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak in the floor sent his nerves on edge. He had spent nights wandering the house with the baseball bat in his hand, knowing the men were gone but unable to shake the feeling that they might return. The loneliness was suffocating. The silence of the house bore down on him, thick and heavy, pressing against his chest like an unbearable weight. He had stopped cooking meals, had stopped turning on the lights when he entered a room. There was no need. The house wasn't home anymore. It was just a place where memories lived, where pain lingered in the walls, where Monica's absence was louder than any sound. Time lost meaning. He stopped keeping track of the days. The clock on the wall ticked, but it never felt like it moved. Morning and night blurred together, and he functioned only because his body demanded it. He ate because he had to, drank because his throat burned from dryness, but none of it mattered. The only thing that gave him purpose was the search. He read every police report he could find, scoured news articles, listened to crime reports on the radio. He called the detective assigned to the case every few days, only to hear the same frustrating answer: no leads, no arrests. The men who had done this to Monica were still out there, free, living their lives as if nothing had happened. John couldn't accept that. He began driving through the city at night, stopping in front of rundown motels, bars, and alleyways where men like them might hide. He stared at faces, looking for any flicker of recognition, any clue that might lead him to them. He visited places he had never set foot in before, his hands always curled into fists, ready for a fight that never came. Each night ended the same way, returning home, defeated, hollow, and angrier than before. He started watching the news obsessively, hoping for anything, a name, a description, a detail the police had missed. Weeks passed, then months. His patience wore thin, but he refused to give up. He had nothing left but this. And then, one night, it happened. The television flickered in the dim light of his living room. The news anchor was reporting on a brutal home invasion in a nearby city. The details were chillingly familiar: 2 masked men, a broken door, a defenseless family. Then, the grainy footage appeared on the screen. A security camera had captured one of the suspects leaving the scene. The image wasn't perfect, but John didn't need it to be. He knew that face. His body went rigid, his breath halting in his throat. The man on the screen, the sharp jawline, the way he carried himself, it was him. One of the men who had shattered his world. Rage ignited in his chest, a slow-burning fire that had been smoldering for too long. His hands clenched into fists. Now, he had a name. A face. A trail to follow. Now, he had a chance. John knew the police were still searching, but he had no intention of waiting. Every second those men remained free was a second too long. He had seen their faces, studied their movements, and now he had a lead. He just needed to be faster. He started where the police wouldn't, on the streets. The men who had destroyed Monica's life weren't professionals. They were opportunists, predators who targeted homes in the dead of night and disappeared before morning. They wouldn't have a permanent hideout. They wouldn't stay in one place for too long. They would be hiding somewhere cheap, somewhere anonymous, somewhere no one asked questions. Motels. John spent nights driving through the city, moving from one rundown establishment to the next. He watched the parking lots, memorized the faces of those who came and went. He sat in his truck with the engine off, sipping stale coffee, waiting for something, anything, that would lead him to them. The nights blurred together, stretching into weeks. He barely ate, barely slept. His entire existence had narrowed to a single purpose. His hands trembled from exhaustion, but his mind stayed sharp, fueled by something stronger than fatigue. Then, one night, he saw them. It was a no-name motel on the edge of town, the kind that smelled of cigarette smoke and desperation. The neon sign flickered, buzzing weakly against the cold night air. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a few battered cars. And then they appeared. Two men stepped out of a rusted sedan, moving with the same arrogance, the same casual disregard for the world around them. John felt his pulse slow, his breathing steady. His hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. It was them. There was no doubt. He didn't move. He watched. They checked in without speaking to the clerk, exchanging cash before taking the key and disappearing into one of the rooms. John didn't follow. Not yet. He had learned patience in the last few months. Rushing in without a plan would only get him killed. For 3 days, he watched them. He learned their routines. The taller one left early in the morning, sometimes for hours, returning with bags of food and alcohol. The other stayed behind, sleeping most of the day. At night, they drank, sometimes arguing, sometimes laughing. They were comfortable. They weren't afraid. They thought they were safe. They were wrong. John prepared carefully. He packed the tools he needed, a baseball bat, zip ties, duct tape. He rehearsed every step in his head, every movement planned with precision. There would be no mistakes. The fourth night, they returned late. The car pulled into the lot, the doors slammed shut, their voices carrying through the cold air. They were drunk. Sloppy. John waited until they reached the door. Then he moved. The bat swung with all the strength he had left in his body. The taller one never saw it coming. The crack of wood against bone echoed in the night. He collapsed instantly, his head striking the pavement with a sickening thud. The second man turned, too slow, his reflexes dulled by alcohol. John's next swing connected with his knee. He screamed, crumpling to the ground, clutching his leg. John didn't give him time to recover. He dropped the bat, grabbed the man by the collar, and dragged him toward the truck. The other was already unconscious, dead weight as John hauled him across the asphalt. He worked quickly, binding their wrists, shoving them into the back. The drive home was a blur, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly he thought his bones might snap. The night was eerily quiet, the streetlights casting elongated shadows across the road. His mind was focused on one thing: what came next. When he pulled into his driveway, he cut the engine and sat in the silence for a moment, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He stepped out, opened the truck's back door, and yanked the first man out. He groaned, barely conscious, but John didn't care. He dragged him toward the basement entrance, threw open the door, and shoved him inside. The second man followed, just as unceremoniously. The basement was cold, damp, and unforgiving. The air smelled of mildew and dust, the single overhead bulb casting a dim, flickering glow. John secured them to 2 wooden support beams, their hands pulled behind their backs, feet bound together. He yanked the duct tape from his bag and slapped a strip across their mouths before stepping back to take them in. Bound. Helpless. Exactly as they had left him that night. Their eyes fluttered open, the first man jerking against his restraints, the second groaning as the pain in his shattered knee set in. They looked up at him, confusion bleeding into fear as the reality of their situation dawned on them. John stood in front of them, breathing heavily, his grip tightening around the bat. His pulse slowed. His mind cleared. For the first time in months, he felt something other than grief. He felt control. And now, it was their turn to beg. The basement was cold and damp, the walls lined with exposed brick that absorbed the dim, flickering light from a single hanging bulb. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline and rusted metal, a suffocating mix of damp concrete and something more primal, the metallic tang of fear. It settled deep in John's chest, curling around his lungs like a vice. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. John stood motionless, gripping the handle of a heavy hammer. His knuckles were white, his fingers wrapped so tightly around the worn wood that they ached. The weight of it felt different now, not like a weapon, but like a decision waiting to be made. Before him, the two men sat on the floor, bound at the wrists and ankles with thick rope, their backs pressed against the basement wall. Their mouths were covered with strips of duct tape, muffling their frantic breathing. They were awake now. Their eyes darted wildly, scanning the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The taller one squirmed, his breath coming in rapid, panic bursts. The other remained frozen, his body trembling as though he understood exactly what was about to happen. John said nothing. He only stared. He had envisioned this moment so many times in the past few months. He had imagined their fear, their helplessness. He had thought about what it would feel like to be the one in control, to hold their lives in his hands the way they had held his daughter's. But standing there now, hammer in hand, he didn't feel the satisfaction he had expected. There was no triumph, no relief. Only a void. The images in his head were clearer than ever. Monica's broken voice calling his name. The sickening laughter. The sounds of their cruelty echoing through the walls of their home. He could still feel the ropes biting into his wrists, still hear the way they had spoken about his daughter like she was nothing more than an object for their amusement. His grip on the hammer tightened. The taller man let out a muffled whimper, shaking his head violently, his eyes pleading. The other squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for what was to come. They had begged before, but it hadn't stopped them then. John wasn't sure it would stop him now. He lifted the hammer. The weight felt natural in his hands. It would be easy. One swing. A second. He had the power now, and for the first time since that night, he could make them feel even a fraction of what they had done to Monica. He could rewrite the ending of this story, his story. And then, voices. They were faint at first, barely audible through the thick walls of the basement. But they were there. Muted conversation, the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside. Someone was nearby. His breath hitched. He stood frozen, his ears straining to catch every sound. The voices grew clearer. A man, a woman, neighbors, maybe. Their words were indistinct, but their tone carried curiosity, concern. Then came the knock. It was soft, hesitant. But it was enough. John's pulse pounded in his ears. His fingers loosened around the hammer, and for the first time in hours, doubt crept into his mind. He turned toward the staircase leading up to the main floor. Another knock followed, this time louder. And then, the sirens. Distant at first, then growing closer. The unmistakable wail of approaching police cars. A flash of panic shot through him. The two men on the floor jerked in their bindings, their eyes widening. They knew what was coming. They knew their luck had just turned. John took a step back, his heart slamming against his ribs. The sound of doors slamming outside sent a jolt of finality through him. The moment stretched, suspended in time. He had one last choice. The hammer slipped from his grasp, landing with a dull thud on the concrete floor. It was over. John stood frozen, his breath shallow, his heart hammering against his ribs. The pounding on the front door grew louder, more urgent. The voices outside were firm, authoritative, demanding entry. Red and blue lights flickered through the basement window, casting distorted shadows across the cold concrete walls. He turned his gaze back to the two men on the floor. They were still bound, still helpless. The taller one had gone pale, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. The other sat stiff, his hands twitching against the restraints. Their wide, frantic eyes flicked between John and the ceiling, where the heavy footfalls of approaching officers echoed like a countdown. John's hands trembled. He tightened his grip on the hammer, his knuckles turning white. He had spent months chasing this moment, dreaming of justice, of revenge. He had envisioned their terror, their suffering, had imagined the satisfaction of watching them beg as he took from them what they had taken from his daughter. And yet, he had never imagined this. The pounding turned to violent rattling as the police worked to force the door open. A final warning was shouted, sharp and commanding. John closed his eyes. His jaw clenched. His muscles tensed, every instinct screaming at him to move, to finish what he started before they took that choice away from him. But then he remembered. Monica. Her small, fragile body curled up in that hospital bed, her hollow eyes staring through him as if she no longer saw the world around her. Her silence, heavier than any scream. The broken girl who had once been his daughter. Nothing he did here would change that. His fingers loosened around the hammer's handle. His breath steadied. Slowly, he turned and walked up the basement stairs. The second his foot hit the top step, the door burst open. Flashlights cut through the darkness, blinding him. Shadows moved quickly, heavy boots storming into the house. He barely had time to raise his hands before a knee slammed into his back, forcing him to the ground. Cold metal snapped around his wrists, the weight of handcuffs digging into his skin. The officers moved swiftly, securing the house. Voices barked orders, radios crackled with incoming updates. John didn't resist. He barely moved at all. He heard them find the basement door. Heard the shouts of surprise, the rush of bodies moving downward. The moment they saw what was inside, the chaos exploded. More officers poured into the room, more commands, more orders. He could hear the muffled cries of the two men, their voices cracking with desperation as they tried to make themselves sound like victims. John didn't flinch. They had begged before. It hadn't stopped them from doing what they did to Monica. He was dragged to his feet and shoved toward the front door. The cold night air hit him like a wall as he stepped outside, blinking against the blinding red and blue lights. A crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, neighbors, strangers, their faces a mixture of curiosity and unease. Murmurs spread through them as the police pushed him toward the squad car. He didn't care. He was placed in the back seat, the door slammed shut behind him. The voices outside faded into a dull hum, the world shrinking into the confines of the vehicle. He sat still, his hands resting in his lap, his head against the cool glass. Sometime later, minutes, hours, he couldn't tell, a man slid into the front passenger seat. John turned his head slightly. Detective Harris. He had seen him before, at the hospital, when Monica was first admitted. Harris didn't speak right away. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, flipping through a few pages before glancing at John through the reflection in the rearview mirror. Then he spoke. The men in the basement were officially in custody. The evidence found in John's home had been matched to a string of home invasions, sexual assaults, and at least 2 murders in nearby counties. They weren't just criminals. They were predators. And now, they were done. John exhaled slowly, staring straight ahead. Harris kept talking, saying something about legal consequences, about the charges John himself would face. Unlawful imprisonment. Assault. Maybe worse. John barely listened. The law could decide his fate. It didn't matter. What mattered was that those men would never walk free again. What mattered was that no other father would have to hear his daughter's screams in the dead of night. For the first time in months, he let his eyes close. He would never bring Monica back to the life she had before. He would never erase what had been done to her. But he had done something. For the first time since that night, John Carter felt something close to peace.